Who commands whom? Netanyahu to the United States, or the United States to Netanyahu? Let everyone draw their own conclusions. I believe that Zionists govern the United States. They command in the White House, in Congress, in the media, on social media. And the world has reacted. The massacre, the genocide against the Palestinian people has reached such a level of barbarism, of blood and death, that the entire world has created a greater awareness today of peace, The world that is coming now will be very different than the world we had before. We had to go through this pain. We had to go through so much blood and suffering. It is unacceptable, as the Vatican's Foreign Minister, Pietro Parolin, said today. What is being done to the Palestinian people?
Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss one of these deep dives. Today we're going to explore one of the most complex and controversial conflicts of recent years. The confrontation between the United States under President Donald Trump and Venezuela. A conflict that has drawn intense debate around the world. This story involves military strikes, the capture of President Nicolas Maduro, international law, geopolitical strategy, and perhaps most importantly, the human lives caught in the middle. It is a story without simple answers, and it is precisely that complexity that we're going to unpack together. Venezuela has been in a state of profound crisis for over a decade. Economic collapse, shortages of food and medicine, mass migration, and accusations of authoritarian governance haven't all contributed to a social unrest and instability. At the same time, the Trump administration has escalated its involvement, arguing that Venezuela posed not only a political problem, but a security threat. In late 2025 and early 2026, these tensions reached a breaking point. US forces launched targeted strikes on Venezuelan military and strategic sites, resulting in explosions near Caracas, and in a highly controversial move, Maduro and his wife were captured and transported to the United States to face charges related to drug trafficking and terrorism. It is tempting to look at this and see a clear narrative of right and wrong, but the truth is far more complicated. From the perspective of the United States, there were compelling reasons to act. US officials have argued that criminal organizations operating within Venezuela, allegedly with the support of Maduro's government, posed a direct threat to American citizens by exporting drugs and violence. The military strikes, the blockades, and the eventual capture of Maduro were presented as necessary steps to neutralize that threat, to protect citizens, and to uphold law and order. Supporters of these actions also point to Maduro's record as an authoritarian leader, citing manipulated elections, suppression of opposition, and violations of human rights. From this perspective, decisive action was not only justified, but essential to restore stability and potentially democracy to a nation in turmoil. There is also the undeniable fact that Venezuela occupies a strategically important position in Latin America and possesses some of the largest oil reserves in the world. While America's statements focus on security and democracy, critics point out that economic and geopolitical considerations are likely intertwined with these motives. On the other side, the perspective from the Venezuela and many international observers is different. From their point of view, the United States acted as an aggressor, violating Venezuela's sovereignty and international law. Military action without the approval of the United Nations raises serious questions about legality. And the strikes, blockades, and capture of a sitting head of state are seen as many acts of aggression. Maduro's government denies the allegations of drug trafficking and frames these claims as pretext for regime change. Beyond legal and political arguments, there is the human cost. Venezuelans are already living in a fragile state, facing shortages, displacement, and social unrest. Escalation of military action only compounds these hardships and threatens to destabilize neighboring countries. Latin America leaders have expressed deep concern that such intervention sets a dangerous precedent and risks creating broader regional instability. International reactions have reflected this divide. Countries like China, Russia, Mexico, and several European states condemned the US strikes, emphasizing the importance of respecting sovereignty and following international law. Others expressed cautious support for the removal of Maduro, framing it as a potential sweep toward democracy and regional stability. Even within the United States, the operation has been debated intensely. Politicians, legal scholars, and members of the public have questioned whether sufficient evidence was presented to justify military action and whether the long-term consequences were fully considered. At the heart of all this, however, are the people of Venezuela. Civilians bear the brunt of conflict, regardless of which side one supports. Families face displacement, communities are disrupted, and access to basic necessities become even more unlikely. Any military intervention, no matter the reasoning behind it, carries consequences for human lives that cannot be ignored. A balanced perspective demands that we recognize both the security concerns raised by the United States and the sovereignty and humanitarian concerns raised by Venezuela and the international community. Looking at history, this situation fits into a broader pattern. Powerful nations have long intervened in weaker states under the banners of security, democracy, or humanitarian protection. In many cases, even well-intentioned interventions have had consequences. Civilian populations suffer, political instability deepens, and the long-term outcomes are often unpredictable. The Trump-Venezuela conflict reflects this tension. While short-term objectives such as neutralizing criminals networks or removing a controversial leader may be achieved, the broader repercussions from regional instability to international criticism are far harder to control. Here's the thing. A lot of people around the world already feel like global politics doesn't operate the way it's presented. They feel like decisions are made long before speeches are given, that alliances matter more than public opinion, and that some relationships carry more weight than others. What happened after recent conflicts in the Middle East only added fuel to that suspicion. The United States responded quickly and decisively, offering political backing, military support, and diplomatic protection. Many governments followed suit, others didn't. From one perspective, this is normal geopolitics. Allies support allies. From another perspective, people start to ask questions. Why is support so unconditional? Why is criticism discouraged? Some cases, but encouraged in others. Why do some nations face sanctions immediately while others don't? Even when civilian suffering is involved. Maduro's question taps into that discomfort, not because it proves anything, but because it voices something many already suspect, that influence might flow in directions we're not supposed to talk about openly. That power might not always sit where we're told it does. And globally, the reactions were split. Some countries echoed US positions almost word for word. Others, particularly nations that have historically clashed with Western power, openly challenged the narrative. Venezuela, Iran, parts of Latin America, parts of Africa, they frame the situation as evidence of a global imbalance, where certain voices matter more than others. Why is trust eroding? Why so many people no longer believe official explanations at face value? Why skepticism has become mainstream? Because if everything were transparent, if power were evenly distributed, if international law applied the same way to everyone, these questions wouldn't stick. They wouldn't spread, they wouldn't resonate, and yet they do. So when Maduro asks, who commands who? He's not just talking about the US and Israel. He's talking about a global system where influence, money, military power, and political alliances intersect, often away from public view. The end result feels the same to many people. Decisions made far above the public, with consequences felt far below. So no, this isn't about believing everything you hear. It's about recognizing why people question things in the first place, why statements like Maduro's land the way they do, why global responses sometimes feel coordinated, rehearsed, almost automatic. In a world where trust in institutions is collapsing, conspiracy thinking doesn't come from nowhere. It grows in the gaps, the silence, the inconsistencies, the double standards. So the real takeaway here isn't who commands who, it's why so many people no longer believe the official narrative.
In other words, we'll be selling oil,
Listen to this.
probably in much larger doses because they couldn't produce very much because their infrastructure was so bad. So we'll be selling large amounts of oil to other countries, many of whom are using it now, but I would say many more will come.
The Venezuelan people don't understand what just happened. The US took their leader and now runs Venezuela. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. They have 300 billion barrels of crude oil, totaling over 17 trillion in US dollars. The largest reserves in the world. The US has just went into Venezuela, taken their leader. You can say all the bad things about the leader you want. It's a shithole country. But they've just taken over Venezuela, a sovereign nation, and now plan to sell its oil reserves, which is a huge sum of wealth. It's 4 times larger than all of Japan's GDP. 17 trillion worth. That's in reserves. The Venezuelans don't even...
Modern wars aren't really about flags anymore. They're not about ideology the way we get told. And they're definitely not about democracy. They are about leverage. Because once you start controlling the flow of energy, you start controlling currencies. And once you control currencies, you influence governments. And when you can influence governments, you don't actually need to conquer the world. The world kind of bends on its own. Trump didn't need to legally own Venezuelan oil. That would be messy, illegal, and almost impossible to justify internationally. What he needed was something far more effective. A power vacuum. A broken leadership structure. And a situation where US companies could step in, backed by US force, and present themselves as stabilizers. Call it reconstruction, call it humanitarian aid, call it economic partnership. But control doesn't really care what label you put on it. So let's talk motive for a second. Why now? Why Venezuela when there are plenty of unstable countries around the world? Because Venezuela isn't just unstable. It's sitting on oil reserves big enough to reshape global markets for decades. Not next year, not 5 years from now, for generations. And here's the uncomfortable part. If these reserves ever came fully online under a government that wasn't friendly to the US, maybe aligned with rivals, or alternative financial systems, that would permanently weaken US energy leverage. It's not a short-term problem, it's a strategic nightmare. And in geopolitics, that's a red line. This also explains why UN opposition didn't really matter. The UN doesn't have an army, it doesn't have oil rigs, and it doesn't have real reinforcement power when a superpower decides to move anyway. International law only works when powerful countries choose to respect it. And when they don't, they are reminded of an old rule most people don't like admitting. Power decides legality, not the other way around. Trump's rhetoric often sounds chaotic, impulsive, even contradictory, but sometimes chaos is useful, sometimes it's camouflage. Say one thing publicly, do another behind the scenes. Let confusion blur intention. So when he says the US already controls the largest oil reserve, he might not be stating a legal fact. He might be signaling confidence to allies, rivals, and markets, basically saying, This is already ours in practice. We're just catching up to reality. And if that's true, then Venezuela wasn't invaded to get oil. It wasn't invaded to make sure no one else ever really controls it. A country with the world's largest oil reserves, a leadership that openly admits they can't exploit them, a superpower claiming dominance anyway, United Nations opposition ignored, military action taken regardless, reconstruction framed as opportunity, US companies waiting in the wings. That doesn't look random, that looks planned. Call it realism, call it paranoia, believe it or don't. But when energy, power, and military force collide, the truth is almost never as clean as the press release. So maybe the question isn't, did foul play happen? Maybe the real question is, in a world built on oil, influence, and leverage, why would anyone expect clean hands? Thanks for watching, and talk soon.